The hill had been burned black long before the first American boots ever touched its soil. Locals called it Suan Ko Jen, Black Palm Ridge, because the palm trees that once stood tall along its slopes had been scorched by old napalm strikes, leaving behind twisted trunks like the charred ribs of some dead giant. Even in daylight, the place felt wrong. But now, with dusk bleeding out across the sky, it looked like the doorway to another world. A harder one. A crueler one. Lieutenant Daniel Halloran crouched low behind a boulder, half cracked by shrapnel, and wiped soot mud from his eyes. The ridge groaned with wind, carrying the smell of old ash and the taste of iron. 3 yards below him, the ground dropped into a steep slope littered with burnt palm husks and exposed roots sharp as claws. Farther down, beyond the haze of smoke drifting up from the valley, the jungle stirred restlessly, alive with shadows, shuffling boots, and voices speaking the clipped, disciplined cadence of North Vietnamese regulars. His radio operator, PFC Jimenez, pressed a trembling hand to the set on his back. "Lieutenant, they're tightening again. Left flank's shot to hell. Right side's nearly gone." Halloran didn't need the update. He could see it, hear it, feel it in the ground. The entire ridge was closing around them like the jaws of a trap. Bravo Company's 2nd Platoon had been fighting their way uphill all afternoon, pushed and hunted by NVA forces that seemed to replenish from the trees as fast as they could shoot them down. What was left of Halloran's men, 27 at the start, now barely 18, were stranded near the top of a position they never wanted. High ground that was far too exposed, hemmed by a cliff at their backs and 3 advancing enemy elements below. A burst of AK fire ripped across the slope, chewing bark off one of the few surviving stumps. Private Kovac, one of the youngest in the platoon, ducked so fast he fell backward onto his pack. "They're everywhere," he gasped, rolling onto his elbows. "Sir, we—" Halloran grabbed him by the webbing, dragging him behind cover as another burst tore through where the kid had been seconds earlier. "Keep your head down. They want us panicking. Don't give it to them." But fear was already crawling through the platoon's bones. The ridge was open, unforgiving. The NVA owned the jungle below. They were like shadows rising from the ground. And every minute they crept farther up the hill. Halloran raised his binoculars. Movement. Figures shifting between the blackened palms, closing in from 3 directions. Left, right, center. A classic pincer. No drones, no artillery, no air support. Just raw instinct and the smell of imminent death. Jimenez twisted the radio knob again. Still nothing. Storms messing everything up. Thunder rolled somewhere deep in the clouds. Lightning flickered across the sky, briefly illuminating the battlefield in stark white. Rain threatened, but hadn't fallen yet. Like the sky was waiting for someone to die before it opened. Halloran snatched the handset. "Bravo 2-6 to any unit in range. Do you copy? We need immediate assistance. Immediate." Static. A long hiss like the ridge itself mocking them. He tried again. "Any friendly unit. We are pinned and surrounded on Black Palm Ridge." Repeat, Black Palm Ridge. "We're—" A single crackle cut through the static. Faint, almost imaginary. "Receiving." "Repeat your last." Halloran froze. The voice wasn't American, not Army, not Marines. The accent was sharper, rougher, stretched by a drawl he hadn't heard since training exchanges months earlier. "What the hell?" Jimenez muttered. "Is that Australian?" Halloran keyed the mic again. "This is Bravo 2-6. We are surrounded, low on ammo, many wounded. We're on the upper ridge. Any help you can spare." More static. Then again, clearer. "Dingo 3. Copy that. Bravo 2-6. Hold position. Do not expose yourself. We're coming from your rear. 20 minutes. Rear?" Halloran blinked. The rear of the ridge wasn't a path. It was a vertical drop. A slick, muddy wall of stone and roots that even his best climbers wouldn't dare in daylight, let alone under fire and storm clouds. How the hell are they coming from the rear? Kovac whispered. Halloran didn't answer. Because he didn't know. Because it shouldn't be possible. Because 20 minutes might as well be 20 years with the NVA this close. As if to emphasize the point, the jungle below erupted in another volley of fire. An RPG streaked through the twilight and detonated 10 yards to the left, throwing dirt and black palm shrapnel across the slope. Screams followed. 2 more men hit. Halloran clutched the radio handset with white knuckles. Dingo 3, how many are you? A pause. 6. 6? 6 men against 60 NVA? But the voice on the radio wasn't panicked, wasn't rushed. It sounded like someone stating the weather. Calm, controlled, almost unsettlingly sure. Jimenez swallowed hard. Sir, can they really get to us? Halloran stared at the black wall of jungle below and the blacker wall of cliff behind. The ridge was a coffin. The lid was closing. I don't know, he said quietly. But if they're coming from the rear, then maybe they're not regular infantry. He looked up at the storm clouds gathering overhead. Maybe there's something else. As the NVA crept higher and the sky dimmed to bruised purple, Halloran gave the only order he could. Hold the ridge. Hold until the Australians arrive. He didn't know if they'd survive 20 minutes. But for the first time all day, he felt something like hope. Sharp, fragile, dangerous, and born from a single, impossible promise. We're coming from your rear. 2 kilometers south of Black Palm Ridge, in a strip of jungle the locals called the Broken Forest. 6 Australians were already moving long before Halloran finished his radio transmission. Captain Rourke, leader of SAS Patrol Dingo 3, snapped the handset back onto Rowe's radio pack and spoke in a tone that carried the weight of experience rather than urgency. Bravo 2-6 is about to be swallowed. We move. No drama, no speeches, just motion. The Australians shifted formation instantly. Silent, efficient, practiced. Where American patrols thundered through the bush in cautious packs, the SAS seemed to slide across the jungle floor. Their steps were whispers, their silhouettes low, their weapons carried not with tension, but with the calm ease of men who had walked into death enough times to understand its rhythm. Mallory took point, fingers brushing leaves and mud, reading the terrain like a second language. Quinn ghosted behind him, SLR angled downward. Pierce checked the demolition charges strapped tight against his chest. Lawson carried the medic pack, but moved like a hunter, not a healer. Rowe brought up the rear, antenna wrapped in canvas to hide its shine. The jungle thickened as they approached the ridge's rear escarpment. Rain spat from the sky in sporadic bursts, the storm building overhead like a lung-drawing breath. Mallory slowed and lifted a fist. Freeze. The team stopped mid-step. Not slowed, stopped. Like statues hidden beneath the dripping canopy. Above them, just 10 meters upslope, an NVA patrol walked the ridge's lower perimeter, moving left to right with rifles at the ready. The soldiers scanned the forest lazily but methodically. This side of the ridge was considered impossible to ascend. Their job was merely to listen for any stray movement. Rourke felt the tickle of rain running down his nose but didn't wipe it. Didn't blink, didn't shift weight. Freeze wasn't simply stillness, it was erasure. The NVA patrol paused. One soldier scraped mud off his sandal with a stick, looking downhill. His eyes passed straight over Mallory, passed right over Rourke. Then the patrol moved on. 10 seconds after their footsteps faded, Rourke tapped Mallory's boot. Fade. Fade was movement without being seen. Movement that didn't exist when in the enemy brain. The SAS began a sideways drift across the slope, each step no larger than the width of a leaf. They moved with the rain's rhythm, stepping only when droplets pattered loudly enough to mask their sound. When thunder rumbled, they slid forward several more meters. The ridge rose ahead of them like a black wall, its rear face nearly vertical. A mix of mud-coated rock and tangled roots, slick from decades of monsoon seasons. Even veteran climbers would hesitate. Rourke didn't. He pointed upward. Mallory climbed first, using roots like rungs. Mud smeared down his sleeves. His boots held just enough friction to keep him from sliding back into the void. Quinn followed, then Pierce and Lawson. Rowe came last, the radio pack adding weight that turned every foothold into a gamble. Halfway up, thunder boomed. So close, the entire cliff vibrated. For an instant, the rain intensified, turning the rock face into a living waterfall. Rourke dug his fingers into a root and braced until the vibration subsided. Below them, another NVA patrol trudged past, this one closer, pausing occasionally to listen. Rowe froze in mid-climb, balancing on one toe and 3 fingertips. A single slip would cascade them all off the cliff, but they didn't slip. They didn't breathe. The patrol passed. 5 minutes later, they reached the ridge's upper rear shelf, a narrow strip of ground just below the summit. Here, the forest thinned, replaced by charred palm trunks jutting like burnt spears out of the soil. Mallory crouched and inspected the ground. "Blood," he whispered. "American, not fresh. Maybe 30 minutes old." Rourke nodded. "They've been pushed uphill, hard." From the summit above came the distant rattle of gunfire. Short bursts, heavy breathing between shots, the unmistakable rhythm of men fighting for their lives. The Australians continued moving, their shapes weaving through the burnt palms. The scent of charred wood mixed with the metallic tang of gunpowder. Every few meters they found evidence of the battle. Shell casings, torn webbing, footprints filled with rainwater. A sudden crack echoed across the ridge, an RPG detonation. The explosion lit the entire summit in a brief flash of orange. Lawson exhaled sharply. "Christ, they're getting chewed up." Rourke didn't need the confirmation. Bravo 26's position was collapsing. The NVA were less than 10 minutes from overwhelming the hilltop. And yet Dingo 3 didn't rush. They moved faster, yes, but never loudly, never recklessly. Because if the NVA discovered them too early, the entire plateau would fill with fire. Mallory raised his hand again and pointed through a gap in the scorched palms. There, silhouettes, American helmets, bodies pressed low behind stones and dead trees, men shaking, bleeding, firing blindly downslope. Halloran's platoon. Rourke studied the angles, the slope, the positions of NVA muzzle flashes below. He counted 3 enemy elements. One on the left flank, one on the right, one moving directly up the middle. A classic closing triangle, and the Americans were the point. Rowe whispered, "We're cutting it close." Rourke's jaw tightened. "No, they're cutting it close. We're right on time." Lightning tore across the sky, illuminating 6 Australians in the burned forest. They had arrived. Behind the enemy. Exactly where the NVA least expected ghosts to be. Rourke tapped Mallory's shoulder. "Eyes on. No noise. We're going in." And like that, Dingo 3 slipped closer. Shadows in a dead forest, preparing to do the impossible. The final stretch to the American position was the most dangerous. Not because the enemy was closest there, but because panic was. Panic made men unpredictable. It made them shoot at shadows, flinch at movement, and whisper too loudly at the worst possible time. Rourke signaled the patrol forward. Mallory crawled first, slithering between 2 charred palm trunks, then dropped into a shallow gully filled with wet ash. Quinn slid beside him, rifle angled low, eyes watching the tree line where flickers of muzzle flashes blinked like fireflies. 20 yards ahead, Lieutenant Halloran and what remained of his platoon clung to a half-collapsed defensive ring, little more than rocks, burnt stumps, and mud scraped into rough cover. Their silhouettes shuddered every time a burst of gunfire cracked up the slope. One American spotted movement. Mallory's helmet crest, barely visible through smoke. and nearly fired. Mallory reacted instantly. He surged forward, grabbed the soldier's wrist, and pressed a gloved hand over the man's mouth. "Friendly," Mallory whispered, voice flat, steady. "SAS, don't shout." The young private's eyes went wide. For a moment he fought against the hand, adrenaline spiking. Then Mallory eased up just enough to let him breathe. The private swallowed hard. You came from behind us." "Yeah," Mallory said. "Long story, not now." He guided the soldier deeper into cover before another pair of eyes spotted him. The rest of Dingo 3 crawled into the American perimeter one by one. Blackened, wet, silent, like demons rising from the earth. Lieutenant Halloran's expression shifted from disbelief to something like awe. "You actually made it," he whispered. Rourke knelt beside him. "You're still pinned." "Pinned?" Halloran barked softly. "We're half dead. I've got 9 wounded who can't walk. I've lost sight of my right flank completely, and they're about to hit us with another charge." Rourke scanned the slope below. He counted muzzle flashes, looked for movement patterns, watched the palm shadows shift. "They'll push in 2 waves," Rourke said. "Left and right at the same time. Main force climbs up the gully. Be ready." Halloran blinked. "You saw all that in 10 seconds? "Didn't have to," Quinn murmured, settling into a firing position behind a rock. "They're announcing it with their spacing." Jimenez, still hunched over the radio, stared at the Australians like they'd stepped out of a legend. Are you guys ghosts or something?" Pierce smirked. "We pay taxes same as you. Now keep quiet." Down the hill, the jungle suddenly went still. The Americans felt it first. The change in pressure, the shift in the air. An awful silence, heavier than thunder. Mallory hissed through his teeth. "They're close." A bead of sweat ran down Kovac's cheek. He wiped it too fast. The movement caught Lawson's eye, and the giant medic pressed the boy's head down gently. "Easy. Save the shaking for after." Then crack! A burst of AK fire raked across the ridge, chipping rock inches above Halloran's helmet. Another volley answered from the opposite flank. The Americans ducked, some flattening to the ground. A wounded corporal groaned, clutching his leg. "Stay low," Rourke snapped. Quinn took a slow breath, lined his rifle with a flickering muzzle flash, and fired once. A distant scream confirmed the hit, but it wasn't nearly enough. The jungle erupted. NVA whistles shrieked, signals for assault. Boots rushed the undergrowth. Branches snapped. Dozens of voices rose in coordinated shouts as enemy teams tightened around the ridge. Halloran's heart pounded. "They're charging both flanks." "Not yet," Rourke said. "They're positioning. Charging comes in about 15 seconds. 15. Rourke didn't wait for the rest of the question. He grabbed Mallory's shoulder. "Shift right. You know what to do." Mallory nodded. He vanished. Not ran. Vanished. A ripple in the smoke, a shadow moving among shadows. Quinn shifted to cover the left flank, scanning with surgical precision. Pierce readied a small satchel charge. Lawson crawled to the wounded, applying bandages and pressure packs in silence. Halloran watched the Australians move with growing disbelief. This isn't how infantry moves," he whispered. "No," Rourke said. "This is how you move when you've spent half your life being hunted in forests." Then the NVA made their push. The left flank burst open first. Figures surging through dead palms, firing from the hip. Sparks flew. Bullets hissed. Americans fired back wildly. Quinn fired once, twice, 3 times. Each shot found a target. The left push stalled, but the right flank exploded next. Closer, louder, more focused. Kovac screamed, "They're in the trees. They're coming in from the black palms." Halloran turned to call orders and saw Mallory materialize from the smoke behind 2 NVA soldiers. He struck the first one with the butt of his rifle, then dropped the second with a single shot. The Americans froze. Mallory didn't. He flicked blood off his hand, pointed downslope, and whispered, "More coming, many." The ridge trembled as the main force advanced, 60 men tightening around the hilltop like a closing fist. Halloran's breathing hitched. "We can't hold another push. We're done." Rourke placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "No, you're not done. You're moving." "Moving where?" Rourke pointed behind Halloran, toward the rear of the ridge, toward what looked like nothing but a wall of mud and roots. "We're opening you a way down." Halloran stared at him. "That's a cliff?" Rourke's eyes hardened. "Not after Pierce touches it." As if summoned by name, Pierce slid beside them, clicking the timer on a block of explosive. "Charge is set," he whispered. 2 minutes. 2 minutes. Halloran's heart felt like a drum in his throat. The NVA charge was seconds away. "How long can we hold?" Rourke checked his wristwatch. "Long enough." He rose slightly, eyes sharp, scanning the battlefield. "Everyone prepare to fall back on my mark." The ridge shook again. The jungle roared. The NVA surged. And the Australians, the ghosts of Dingo 3, readied themselves to carve a path through hell. The NVA charge didn't come as a scream or a roar. It came as a weight, a pressure pressing into the air itself as dozens of boots hammered through the undergrowth in synchronized fury. Halloran felt the ridge tremble beneath him. "They're coming!" someone shouted. "No shouting," Rourke snapped. But it was too late, because the jungle was already erupting. AKs barked. RPDs snarled. Grenades thumped against the slope. The enemy surged upward in 3 converging wedges, each formation angled to crush the American perimeter at once. The ridge exploded in noise. Bullets tore through dead palms. Dirt and ash sprayed in sheets. Private Kovac was knocked off his feet, rolling behind a stump as rounds chewed through the earth where his head had been seconds earlier. Pierce's eyes flicked toward Rourke. 1 minute. Rourke nodded. "Quinn, center." Quinn was already moving. He slid down behind a knee-high slab of charred rock just as the first NVA pushed through the central gully. He inhaled once, exhaled, and began firing. Not rapid, not panicked. 1 shot, 1 kill, then another, and another. The entire central wedge buckled, men collapsing as Quinn's bullets punched through the smoke with mechanical precision. But there were too many. Within seconds, the NVA adjusted, angling wide to avoid his line of fire. A dozen soldiers broke left, trying to flank him. 20 more rushed the right, climbing over the burnt palms like ants on a carcass. Halloran ducked as an RPG streaked past and exploded behind them, showering the perimeter in flaming debris. "We're not gonna make it," he shouted over the storm. Rourke grabbed him by the collar and yanked him down just as another burst shredded the air above their heads. "You're making it," Rourke growled. "We're not here to die on your ridge." Pierce checked his timer. 30 seconds. Mallory appeared out of the smoke, dragging a wounded American by his webbing. "That left flank's broken," he hissed. "They'll be on top of us in under a minute." "Then we move in 50 seconds, Rourke said. "Help Lawson on the casualties." Mallory nodded and vanished. The ridge was collapsing into chaos. Americans were firing in all directions, some screaming orders no one heard. The ground vibrated under the sheer number of incoming boots. The NVA whistles grew frantic, signaling a full press. Rourke raised his voice, not yelling, but cutting through the madness with the steel of command. "All call signs, listen up. When the blast goes, we fall back to the rear. Do not hesitate. Do not stop. You move or you die. Understood?" Even amid the roar of combat, they understood. Pierce's voice came over the din. 10 seconds. Rourke grabbed Halloran's shoulder. "Get your men ready." Halloran nodded, adrenaline swallowing fear. "Bravo! Prepare to fall back, on the Aussies' mark." The ridge exploded again with gunfire. A grenade landed near Lawson. Mallory dove, scooping it and flinging it back downslope a split second before it detonated midair. NVA soldiers were now within 30 yards. Shadows through the smoke, figures climbing, yells echoing. Pierce raised his hand. 3. The NVA emerged from the tree line, rifles blazing. 2. Bullets ripped through the perimeter. An RPD gunner dropped to one knee, spraying lead upward. One. Pierce clicked the detonator. The world erupted. A thunderous blast cracked open the entire rear face of the ridge. Dirt, roots, and blackened palm husks flew skyward. A massive slab of mud tore loose, sliding down in a molten cascade. The cliff didn't crumble. It transformed, turning into a slanted chute of wet earth and broken roots. A path, the slide route, and it was wide enough for the entire platoon. Rourke didn't hesitate. Move! The Australians surged backward, dragging Americans with them. Lawson lifted a wounded corporal over his shoulder, sprinting through smoke. Mallory shoved two men toward the opening. Pierce fired over his own shoulder, covering the retreat as NVA soldiers reeled in shock from the explosion. Halloran grabbed Kovac and pushed him forward. Go, move now. The first Americans reached the edge and slid, literally slid down the newly carved chute, boots skidding on mud, grabbing at roots to control their speed. It was chaotic, dangerous, barely controlled. But it was escape. More followed, one after another. A wounded sergeant tumbled, Lawson catching him midway down. Jimenez clutched the radio to his chest as he slid, shouting something that was swallowed by the storm. Bullets rained down from above. NVA soldiers rallied fast, charging through the smoke. They fired blindly toward the collapsing rear. AK rounds peppered the chute, sending sprays of mud into the air. Quinn remained at the top until the last Americans moved past him, firing precise shots that dropped enemies mid-charge. Mallory provided flank fire, cutting down a second wave trying to climb the palm stump line. Rourke stayed dead last. He fired 3 controlled shots, then checked the ridge one last time. Then he jumped. He slid like the rest. Boots cutting into mud, one hand steadying himself on roots, the other still gripping his rifle tightly. Mud splashed his face, the wind howled past his ears, the storm above crackled with lightning. Behind him, the ridge echoed with NVA shouts. They'd reach the rear soon, but they wouldn't catch Dingo 3 today. Rourke hit the bottom, rolled, and sprang up. Count your men, he barked at Halloran. Halloran did. Fast, heart racing. All present, all down. Rourke exhaled, nodded once. Good, because now we run. He pointed into the trees, toward the extraction point. The Australians took the lead. The Americans followed. And together, soaked, bleeding, slipping on mud, the 2 units disappeared into the jungle as the storm swallowed Black Palm Ridge behind them. A ridge they were never supposed to survive. The moment their boots hit the bottom of the slide route, the jungle swallowed them whole. The ridge behind them echoed with shouts, angry, frantic, growing louder with every passing heartbeat. The NVA had recovered from the blast and were now pouring toward the torn open rear face like a river of shadows. Halloran stumbled into the undergrowth, one arm hooked under a wounded sergeant's shoulder. Mud streaked his face, sweat stung his eyes, and his lungs felt like they'd been dipped in fire. But he moved, because stopping wasn't an option, not with that roar behind them. Keep moving. Don't stop, Lawson yelled, hauling another wounded man like he weighed nothing. Mallory swept ahead, carving a path through tangled vines with controlled, surgical cuts of his machete. Quinn stayed behind the column, moving backward in short, practiced steps, rifle raised, scanning the ridge crest. Rourke ran alongside Halloran. How many wounded can walk? 4, Halloran gasped. 5 need help. Then help them, Rourke replied. Alive bodies run faster than dead ones. The storm thickened around them. Rain hammered the canopy, turning the ground into slick sludge. Lightning flashed, illuminating the jungle in sheets of white. Thunder cracked so hard that it rattled the teeth in their skulls. And then, crack, 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 bullets sliced through leaves overhead. They're firing from the ridge, Kovac shouted, nearly tripping as he ducked. They'll get closer, Rourke said. Quinn. Got it, Quinn replied. He dropped to one knee, sighted upward through a gap in the trees, exhaled, crack, A scream. Another muzzle flash offered itself. Crack. Another scream. Then Quinn was moving again. Boots sliding over wet earth as he fell back before the NVA could pinpoint his location. The jungle didn't make it easy. Thick roots snagged ankles. Fallen palms blocked their route. Every few seconds, someone slipped and nearly took 3 men with them. Mallory called back. 200 meters to the creek bed. That's the fastest ground. Rourke nodded. Take us through. They burst out of the foliage into a shallow, rocky creek, whose water moved fast and brown with runoff. The current wasn't strong enough to sweep them away, but it was enough to erase tracks. Into the water, Rourke ordered. The column splashed into the creek, half wading, half running. Water soaked their boots and uniforms instantly, but it also muted their sound and made pursuit harder. Behind them, the NVA hit the slope, blazing with fury. Dozens of shapes appeared at the crest, fanning out, firing, shouting commands. Their bullets hissed into the water like angry insects. Quinn took a knee again, fired 2 more shots. Mallory, halfway down the creek, turned and shouted, "Quinn, move it!" Quinn fired once more. Crack! And then dove behind a boulder as rounds ripped the air where he'd been. He sprinted after them. The creek curved right, leading into denser cover. Vines hung low, palms arched overhead, forming a canopy that broke the incoming fire. Halloran gasped in relief when the bullets thinned. "Are we clear?" Rourke shot him a sideways glance. Not even close. A shrill whistle echoed through the jungle. An NVA signal, Mallory muttered. "They're splitting. They're trying to get ahead of us." "They won't," Rourke said. "Row." The radio man lifted the handset, breathless. "Falcon 1, this is Dingo 3. Where the hell are you?" "Static." Then the sound of roaring rotors. "Dingo 3, Falcon 1 approaching from the south. LZ is too tight. Rope extraction only. You have 3 minutes." Rourke checked his watch. 3 minutes, he said. "Move faster." They burst out of the creek into a small clearing. A ring of ferns lit faintly by lightning. The hum of a helicopter grew louder overhead, beating the air into a storm of its own. The Huey punched through the canopy, its searchlight slicing through sheets of rain. The crew chief leaned out, waving frantically. "Come on, move." Rourke grabbed Mallory. "You take point. Lawson, get the wounded on first. Quinn, cover left. Pierce, right." Mallory sprinted to the center of the clearing, waving a signal flare. The Huey descended lower, rotors whipping the rain sideways in violent gusts. Ropes dropped. "Go! Go now!" Rourke shouted. The Americans rushed forward. Lawson lifted a wounded corporal onto a rope and slapped the kid's harness shut. "Climb! Use your legs!" 2 more wounded were hoisted up. Jimenez clutched the radio as the crew chief grabbed him by the vest and yanked him in. Then the NVA arrived. A line of dark shapes burst from the tree line, firing wildly. Bullets tore into the ferns. One round hit the Huey's skid with a metallic clang. "Contact left," Mallory shouted. Quinn was already firing. Precision shots, controlled, cold. He dropped 3 men before they hit the ground, but more kept coming. Rourke shoved Halloran toward the rope. "Your men go first." "What about you?" "We finish what we started." Halloran grabbed the rope and began climbing, boots slipping. 2 Americans followed, gripping the lines as the helicopter bucked from rotor wash and wind. The clearing erupted in gunfire. Pierce tossed a smoke grenade, filling the left flank with thick, white haze. Mallory fired bursts to break the right flank's advance. Lawson dragged another man to the ropes and threw him over his shoulder like a sack of rice. "Up you go, mate." Rounds snapped past Rourke's ears. He pivoted, firing 2 shots that forced an NVA squad to take cover. The crew chief leaned out, waving desperately. "We can't stay long." "Get them up," Rourke shouted. Halloran reached the helicopter door, pulled inside by 2 crewmen. Another American followed. Then another. Rourke turned. "Neville, last call." Quinn sprinted backward into the clearing, diving for the final rope as Mallory and Pierce laid down suppressive fire. He grabbed the line, locked his boots, and started hauling himself upward. "Rourke!" Mallory yelled. "Your turn!" Rourke fired one last shot, then jumped, catching the swaying rope with one hand and wrapping his boot around it in a single fluid motion. "Go! Lift!" he shouted. The Huey roared skyward. The clearing shrank beneath them. The NVA surged forward, firing until the helicopter rose beyond their reach. Rain hammered the metal skin of the aircraft. Wind tore through the open door. The Americans lay inside, muddy, bleeding, alive. Rourke hung from the rope until the crew chief dragged him in. He collapsed onto the floor, chest heaving. Halloran looked at him, soaked, exhausted, covered in ash, and whispered, "You didn't just rescue us. You dragged us out of hell." Rourke didn't answer. He stared out the open door at Black Palm Ridge disappearing beneath the storm. They weren't out of danger, not yet, but they were alive, and the ghosts of Dingo 3 had gotten them this far. The Huey pitched hard as it clawed upward through the storm, rotors churning rain into sharp sprays that stung every exposed face. Inside the cabin, chaos gave way to a trembling stillness. Men gasping for air, coughing mud, clutching wounds, staring at nothing. But the danger wasn't done. Not even close. Rounds still snapped upward from the jungle below. Green tracers cutting through sheets of rain like angry fireflies. The NVA were firing blindly, tracking the sound of the helicopter, chasing the ghost of a target through the treetops. The crew chief leaned out with his M60 and unleashed a long burst downward. "They're still on us," he shouted over the rotor thunder. Rourke dragged himself upright by grabbing a cargo strap. His fingers left streaks of mud on the metal. "Pilot, keep climbing. Lose them in the storm." The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom. "Trying. She's heavy with all your passengers, and this weather's murder." Lightning flared. A jagged white line splitting the clouds open. Thunder followed in a rolling wave that shook the Huey's frame. The helicopter rocked violently. Halloran grabbed a seat pole, teeth clenched. "Christ, how are we still airborne?" Rourke didn't answer. He didn't know either. Lawson finished applying a dressing to a wounded man, then braced himself as another gust slammed into the aircraft. The medic's calm shook for the first time that night. Mallory crawled forward on his knees, dragging his SLR with him. "They'll lose visibility soon. The squall's too thick." As if on cue, the tracers below began to vanish, drowned in mist and distance. The jungle grew smaller. The ridge faded like a black tooth receding into the throat of the land. But the storm didn't ease, not yet. The Huey pierced another wall of wind. Rain battered the cabin. A turbulent downdraft shoved the helicopter downward so hard that everyone inside lifted off the deck for a split second. Halloran's heart jumped into his throat. "Damn it!" The pilot wrestled the controls. Alarms flickered. The rotor wash fought the storm in brutal, grinding pulses. Rourke gripped a hanger bar and shouted toward the cockpit. "Just get us above the weather." "Working on it." For a terrifying heartbeat, the Huey tilted dangerously to one side. Mallory slammed into Quinn. Kovac slid across the deck with a yelp. Rourke grabbed him by the webbing and hauled him upright. Another flash of lightning illuminated the cabin. Faces streaked with soot and rain, eyes wide, chests heaving. Men who had stared into the jaws of Black Palm Ridge, now staring into the teeth of the sky. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the storm thinned. The Huey pierced through the upper cloud layer like a diver breaching the surface of a black ocean. The sky above was calmer, a deep, bruised purple lit faintly by distant stars. Below them, the storm churned, a rolling mass of gray and white swallowing the jungle whole. Silence fell inside the helicopter. Not full silence, but the heavy, breathless kind. The kind that comes when men realize they are alive, when they shouldn't be. Halloran slumped back against the cabin wall. "We made it," he whispered. "We actually made it." Rourke sat across from him, arms resting loosely on his knees. Mud streaked his face in black lines. His breathing was still controlled, as if he refused to let himself relax. "For now," he said. Quinn finally lowered his rifle. "Hell of a run." Lawson chuckled. "Just once." A short, exhausted sound. Call it what it was. A miracle strapped into a steel bathtub with wings. Some of the Americans laughed. Shaky, disbelieving laughter that seemed to break the tension like a snapped cable. Even Mallory allowed himself a small smirk, but not Rourke. He was staring out the open door, watching the storm clouds swirl below like a living thing. Watching the ridge vanish, watching the ghosts of that blackened forest fade into nothing. Pilot's voice cracked through the intercom. "Approaching base, 2 minutes." The Huey dipped slightly as it descended through thinning rain. The faint glow of perimeter lights appeared through the mist. Warm, distant, impossibly safe. As they approached the landing zone, medics on the ground hurried forward with stretchers and ponchos flapping in the wind. The pads of light illuminated the battered aircraft as it flared for landing. The skids hit the mud. The rotors slowed. The storm gave one final rumble of thunder, as if reluctant to let them go. The crew chief slid the cabin door open and motioned. "Move, we've got you." Lawson carried the worst wounded first. Medics grabbed them and rushed toward the tents. Jimenez nearly fell trying to climb out until Mallory steadied him with one hand. Halloran stepped down onto the mud and felt his knees weaken. Not from injury, but from the sheer weight of finally stopping. He turned back. Rourke was still inside the Huey. The SAS captain hopped down last, boots splashing into the puddled landing zone. He stood there a moment, letting the rain wash over him, letting the reality of the night settle. Halloran approached him slowly. "Captain Rourke." Rourke looked up, eyes still sharp despite the exhaustion. "You saved my platoon." Rourke shook his head. "No. We opened you a door. You decided to walk through it." Halloran swallowed, voice shaking. "Either way, thank you." Rourke studied him for a long moment, then nodded once. A simple gesture, soldier to soldier. Behind them, the Huey's engine whirred down. The storm began to drift away. The ridge was far behind them now, out of sight, but not out of memory. Kovac approached Mallory, still trembling from adrenaline. "How did you guys move like that? I mean, through that mess, with them everywhere." "How did you?" Mallory shrugged. "We learned not to fight the jungle," Quinn added with a tired grin. "We just borrow its silence for a while." Lawson slung his pack and exhaled deeply. Rourke finally spoke, voice softer than the rain. "Tonight the ridge wanted you dead. We just disagreed." Halloran almost smiled. The storm eased to a drizzle. The floodlights glowed warmer. The chaos dissolved into the background hum of a base returning to normal. And in that fragile moment of peace, surrounded by mud, blood, and fading thunder, Lieutenant Halloran realized the truth. They had not been rescued by ordinary soldiers. They had been pulled from the jaws of death by ghosts in green and black. The men of Dingo 3, the Australian shadows who walked where no one else dared. And because of them, Bravo 26 lived to see another dawn.